Welcome, everyone. My name is Brandy Shunk, and I'm on the communications team with Homeschoolers of Maine. You might hear the acronym HOME used as we discussed today, and HOME stands for Homeschoolers of Maine. Today, we're going to be talking about what it was like in the earliest days of homeschooling. And I am privileged to be joined today by Kathi Kearney. And Kathi has been on the board for Homeschoolers of Maine for many years. She's also worked with homeschooling families in Maine for more than 43 years. Kathi helped author our Maine homeschool law, and for that we are most grateful. And she is also a teacher of gifted and talented students, and she consults with families of gifted children across the country and even around the world. Kathi, thank you so much for being here with us today, and welcome.
It's great to be here.
All right, 43 years of history. I know we've got a lot to dive into.
Yep.
So let's just kind of take this one step at a time and share with me kind of the when, where, why, how did this modern homeschooling movement begin here in Maine?
Well, I'm glad you put the emphasis on modern, because Maine is an isolated rural state in many parts of the state. So there have always been some kids who ended up homeschooling because they were not near a school. I'm thinking of Abby Burgess, for instance. The little girl who saved the lighthouse and the ships and everything, they were on a very isolated island. So kids like that, even before the modern homeschooling movement, some of them were homeschooled because it was their only choice.
Right.
If we're thinking about the modern homeschool movement, I would put its start to the late 1970s. And there were only a handful of kids who were homeschooling. At that time, there wasn't a specific homeschool law. There was just the compulsory attendance law, which said that you had to be attending a public school or a private school or receive equivalent instruction approved by the school board and the commissioner.
Okay.
So those very early families in the late 70s were using the law as it was written in that way, because there wasn't a way to officially homeschool at that point. And there were only a handful of families. One of them was a legislator in the Bath area, and one of them was a doctor. And they decided that they wanted to homeschool their kids. And so nobody really exactly knew what to do with it. The school board didn't really know what to do. Yeah. And the education department didn't really know what to do. And so these two ladies finally went to the Department of Education and helped them to craft what were then guidelines for homeschooling. And at least that gave some kind of a format for school boards, because at that time, anything to do with equivalent instruction that wasn't a public school or private school went to the school boards. So when I first started getting involved in homeschooling, I was still teaching preschool at the time.
Okay.
And met in the community a family that had two extremely gifted kids. And the older one, the family told me that they were thinking about homeschooling.
Okay.
And so they asked me if I could help. Well, back then, if you were going to homeschool under these guidelines that had finally come out, you had to write up your curriculum and you had to take it to the local school board, which held a hearing in public.
Oh, wow.
With the press there. So they got approval to homeschool. They had tried their child in public school, and that soon went to public school part-time and homeschool part-time, long before there was even a public school access law. And then finally, they just decided to homeschool because she was so far ahead. they were homeschooling, but back in those days, the superintendent and the school board could basically give you ultimatums about what you had to do. And so they were telling this mom that she had to submit weekly lesson plans to the elementary principal. That was a lot of work, especially for a child who's not necessarily following the usual educational pattern as far as the pacing and the depth of subjects are concerned.
And a little outside the box.
Yes, so they ended up using the Calvert curriculum, which it's like school in a box. It has a teacher's guide and it tells you exactly what you're supposed to do every single day and what to say to the child. So she just handed that over to the principal, and he couldn't say much more than go right ahead. But there began to be more and more people interested in homeschooling in Maine. And they all kept calling my friend. And she was spending hours on the phone. And finally, she said to me, I'm just saying the same things, essentially. Each time I talk to somebody, maybe we could just put everybody in a room together and talk to them all together.
There, efficiency.
So she called a meeting, and she did. And we had a lot of people show up. It ended up turning into the first homeschool support group in the state of Maine.
Oh, wow.
And back in those days, if you were homeschooling, the public school would not give you any textbooks to use. The public school publishers wouldn't sell you any if you were homeschooling.
Okay.
The Christian school publishers also wouldn't sell you anything because they thought people should be in Christian schools. So it left this whole growing group of people without any easy access to curriculum. Now, back then, curriculum meant usually textbooks. And sometimes it meant a few other things, like the Calvert program that came in a box. It was like school in a box. There weren't a lot of other options. So what we decided to do, a Catholic school ended up closing. So they were selling off their textbooks. So we went and bought some textbooks. And then Martin's used to have textbooks for sale in their book department. So every time we would see a textbook in the K-8 or even high school range over there, for $1 or $2, we'd pick it up. And then we had a few families that had some textbooks that they were done using. And so they loaned them. We put them all on my friend's porch for a curriculum lending library. There began to be more and more homeschoolers around the state.
Okay.
And some of them were secular homeschoolers, some were Christian homeschoolers, some were homeschooling just like today because a particular school situation wasn't meeting their child's needs, or they would have put their child in private school, but there weren't any in the area. So they were homeschooling for all kinds of reasons. I do remember at one of those early support group meetings, I remember a lot of people there, and it was people from every kind of background you could imagine that were in those early groups. And we had one dad there who was deciding he was homeschooling because he was Christian and he didn't like what was being taught in the public schools.
Okay.
And another lady who was there, she's the only one I've ever heard say this is what she was. But they ended up having a discussion afterwards. And she said, I'm a secular humanist, and I don't like how the schools are teaching my kids either, because it's not reflecting my values either.
Yeah.
So it was really interesting because you had people from two diametrically opposed situations, and they were coming together because they were kind of in the same situation as far as feeling like the school wasn't in accord with their personal family's values.
Interesting how these very diverse backgrounds can find this common ground of homeschooling and saying, no, we want to be the ones directing our children's education, their morals, their character development, and recognizing that at home is the best place to be able to do that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that happens a lot. And I think that it crosses religious and political lines.
Yeah, absolutely.
People have the right to raise their children in their own family's religious or other values.
Right.
So there began to be more and more homeschoolers. And by more and more, I'm talking about maybe 50 or 60 families across the state.
Okay.
It was becoming a little bit more common. Every time a family would go, want to homeschool, they would have to take their whole curriculum program to the school board and have this hearing in public. So you started to hear about things that were happening in different parts of the state, and school boards that were deciding it was going to be their policy to reject all of the homeschool proposals because they didn't believe in homeschooling. And it got to be kind of ridiculous and kind of bad. And at that point, 4 superintendents who were not friendly to homeschoolers offered to help the Department of Education to come up with uniform homeschooling rules through the rulemaking process across the state. Now, in those days, you didn't go on the internet to find out what rules are being discussed this week. They printed it in the newspaper in tiny print in the classified section, usually. And they sent a letter to superintendents.
Got it.
So the department consultant who was working with these 4 superintendents said, I've got the names and addresses of the 65 kids who are homeschooling in the state. Do you want to send a letter to them as well about these rules? No. If they happen to read about it in the newspaper, they can come. Got it. Well, someone in a superintendent's office saw this letter, some secretary, I think, saw this letter come across and decided to let the homeschoolers in that district know. It happened to be my friend's district. We got to look at those rules, and they were terrible. It was one of the worst pieces of writing I've ever seen, and I've seen some bad ones. So we decided to get this support group together, and anybody else who was interested, in my friend's living room, and ask a local legislator to come and talk to us about how a rules hearing worked, because none of us had ever been to one before.
Yeah. Yeah. What a great idea to pull in the resource and educate yourselves to empower and equip. Even in those early days, to stand up for the freedoms.
Yep.
Yeah,
so she said, sure. It was our local Democratic legislator. She said, sure, she would come and meet with us. And when she got there, the room was packed. I mean, people that we didn't even know were there. People had just come out of the woodwork. And she was very good. She told us exactly what to expect. She told us how to prepare testimony for this meeting. She told us how to dress for the meeting. She told us kids could come as long as they could behave. And so we said, okay. So people were given copies of these proposed rules so they could prepare their testimony. And when this hearing was held, it was probably the hottest day Augusta has ever seen.
Oh, gosh.
And it was in a closed hearing room with no air conditioning.
Got it.
It was a hot meeting in more ways than one.
Well, this sounds very much like, we just recently did the biblical citizenship course, and they were speaking of the early days of the founding of our country and happened under similar circumstances. Everyone in a closed room, hottest day, stuffy, really putting together what became the foundations of the freedoms of our nation. So I love the parallel there, that here you are setting the ground for homeschooling, and a similar situation there.
Oh, it was so hot that day. I couldn't even believe it.
Yeah.
And there was a very good crowd there. There were about 65 kids who were homeschooling at that time. And there was a crowd of over 300 people who showed up to the hearing. So various people testified and said various things. The only person in the room who spoke in favor of the rules as they were written was one of the 4 superintendents.
Wow.
The other 3 didn't say a word. People were angry that they had, had to find out by accident that it was happening instead of being respectfully told it was going to happen. They were pretty angry about that. The rules themselves had all kinds of problems. And part of the problem was that they didn't understand homeschooling and what they were asking for. And the other problem was it was really hard to tell what they really meant. So I spoke, a number of other people spoke. Steve Boitozo, who was a Christian radio, he had a radio business out of Lewiston and ran his own radio shows and his everything. And he was quite a charismatic fellow, and he was a pastor, so he knew how to get people's attention when it was important. And, and so he gets up to speak and he says, well, this is what happens. He says, when you don't let people know this is going to happen and they find out by accident, it's like shaking the hive and out come a bunch of angry bees.
Yes.
I remember the Department of Education consultant getting up after he spoke, and he says, you don't know the half of it. Before I came to this meeting this morning, he said, I had bees in my chimney coming out into the living room.
Wow. So he was really getting it.
So he was getting it all right.
Yeah, he was getting this universal message, it sounds like.
Yes,
Yeah.
he got the message. Sam Lanham, who was a lawyer up in Bangor, he had been asked by one of his clients to come to the meeting, and he was interested also because he was thinking about homeschooling his kids when they got older. He just had a young child at the time. And he got up near the end and he said, I really want to encourage you to fix this. He said, I'm a very busy lawyer and I don't need these people's business, but I'm going to get it if you don't fix this. After that, the department consultant decided this needed another look. And he told the superintendents it was not going to go forth in rulemaking the way that it looked. And he asked, of all of the people who spoke today at the hearing, what are 4 people that you think you could work with, that I could pull in? And they named me. I was a public school teacher. They named Steve Boitozo. They named Merv Keller, who was pastor of the Church of the Brethren in Lewiston. And they named Tim Ketchum.
Okay.
So there were the 4 of us. We'd never met each other before. And they called this first meeting of this group that was going to try to fix these rules. And Steve suggested we meet ahead of time and just go over some strategy and figure out how we were going to handle this. So we decided that the best approach would probably be to try to keep them away from their document for as long as possible in that first 3-hour meeting. So that's what we did. we tried to figure out what they knew and didn't know about homeschooling.
Mhm.
And so we asked them some questions. We just kind of tried to educate them. And we were successful in all but the last 15 minutes of keeping them away from the document,
Mhm.
which bought us and bought them some time to really think this through.
Yeah.
And in the following meetings, which went on that entire summer, I'm thinking this must have been the summer of 1984. We had numerous meetings, and we decided we were going to go through that document with them line by line, sentence by sentence, and fix it.
Mhm.
Where they didn't understand about homeschooling, like they wanted the annual assessment to be a test and that was going to be it. And we're like, no, because there are whole homeschool programs and whole curricular philosophies and whole types of curriculum that don't lend themselves to a grade level test. There need to be some options here. At that point, portfolios were having a thing in the public schools. They were like this new big thing people were going to try. So I'm like, what about a portfolio?
Yeah, there you go.
And well, it would have to come to the school. And I said, well, your school hires certified teachers, correct? Well, yes, of course. And I said, well, how about we let a certified teacher of the family's choice do the portfolio review? So they said, finally said okay with that. They said okay with a certified teacher reviewing the program, not necessarily a full portfolio review. They wanted to keep the test in there. We said, fine. There's certainly programs, where a test would be appropriate. Leave it there. They threw in the option of basically a review by the school district with a certified teacher or administrator on board as one of the options. And they threw in an option that, as far as I know, in all the years it's been there, no one has ever used. And that is a test developed by the local school district appropriate to the homeschool program. So we worked through the summer. We went back and forth with different groups of homeschoolers around the state and said, this is where it's at. This is what they're thinking about. Is this okay? Does this, this going to work? We mostly wanted to build in a lot of choices for families as far as the assessment piece was concerned. And we're still, mind you, in the time period where people were still having to get approval by the local school board. And I think probably the superintendents were right that it shouldn't have been left district by district, that having one set of rules across the state did make sense. To school boards don't often, even now, don't even have any background or real knowledge about education.
Right.
So, asking them to do something like this was really hard when there wasn't anything kind of to go by.
Absolutely.
So these rules went into effect, and things were not perfect by any means, but they, I think, were better than the original rules by the superintendents alone would have been.
Awesome.
I think it was very good to put in those rules various options, because that allowed homeschool programs to be more individualized for kids.
Right. And that speaks to what homeschooling is where you get
right.
to be your individualized. You get to meet the students where they are, each student individually. It may not even look the same for each student within the same family. So that's beautiful that you had that foresight to know we need to be able to address different students, different families, different situations with all of these options.
Right.
Yeah.
So these rules went into effect. They weren't perfect. I mean, they still required you to go before the school board. You still had to show them your curriculum. You still had school board meetings being reported in the press. It's just not good to have your child's education discussed in the press unless you choose it.
Yeah.
And that did not get fixed for many years after that. It didn't get fixed until, I'm going to say, late 80s, early 90s, when they finally decided that you could get, I think they put this in the rules, that you could just send your notice and curriculum to the commissioner only at the Department of Ed, because the school boards were still giving people trouble.
Got it.
Even though they weren't supposed to.
Well, it's really eye-opening, Kathi, to be able to hear, what this was like at the beginning and how people such as yourself were generous and selfless enough to step up and say, this is new ground. We're all figuring this out as we go, but let's bring our unique giftings. Let's bring our unique backgrounds together to come up with a solution for homeschoolers across our state. And on behalf of homeschoolers everywhere, I'd like to thank you personally for your contributions to the freedoms that we enjoy today and to how it is logical and does make sense, at a lot of levels compared to how it was. So as we wrap up this first segment, because we know, Kathi, you have so much more to contribute, so much more wisdom to share. But one thing that you spoke that I just wanted to kind of highlight is a lot of these families, these were lawyers, these were doctors, and they saw that home was where they wanted their children.
And legislators.
And legislators, yes, absolutely. And I think that speaks volumes, and that the original homeschoolers, back in the founding of the country, those were the people homeschooling as well. When public education began, it was a lot of those higher class citizens who said, no, the public school is for them, right? Not for us, because we know better, right?
I think a lot of people, when you think back to late 70s, early 80s, and what was going on in education at the time, there were a lot of people from a wide variety of backgrounds who weren't totally comfortable with what was going on for all kinds of reasons, and not the same reasons.
And obviously, homeschooling isn't for everyone, and public education serves a very important role in society and in educating our young people. But I do think that it's valuable to note that very educated people are choosing to homeschool their children, as well as just normal people like me. Like, I don't have a college degree. I am not, quote, qualified, right, by educational standards to school my children. Yet everywhere we go, our children are praised for how well they interact with others, for how much they know. So really, it is for the families who are called. God equips the called, right?
That's right.
So for the families who are called, the way finds itself for those who are committed. And we just really appreciate, again, people like you laying that groundwork and establishing these freedoms. Kathi, thank you so much for your time today. And we do look forward to meeting again and hearing more from you about how we got where we are, what we went through as homeschoolers, through these past decades, and what we can do as homeschoolers now, today, to help secure the freedoms that you have fought so hard to acquire for us, and how to be vigilant, how to raise freedom fighters, so to speak, in the culture in our homes, and to have homeschooling really be just a part of the fabric of society. Okay. Well, Kathi, thank you so much. And to everyone who's tuned in to us today, thank you as well for your time. You can learn more about Kathi and learn more about protecting homeschool freedoms on the Homeschoolers of Maine website. There is an entire page set up for protecting freedom. You'll find a lot of videos and other resources on how you can bring this in as part of your curriculum to educate your children as well as yourself. And we thank you for your hearts, and we thank you for your time in learning more about the history of homeschooling in Maine. Have a great day.